The first chapter of the history of console-based role-playing games was focused on the Famicom. Nintendo's 8-bit powerhouse offered RPGs a promising sandbox where they could learn to walk, and it was this figurative battleground where the genre proved itself as not just being viable, but being more than capable of competing with flashier arcade shooters and sports sims. But the Famicom wasn't the only sandbox, and other hardware manufacturers began to seek the right angle to not only make a dent in Nintendo's current generation success, but to jockey for position in the next round of technological competition. As the end of the 1980s approached, it was Sega who emerged as the biggest would-be thorn in Nintendo's side, seeking to outshine the dated Famicom with a new, shinier piece of hardware, and set the terms of engagement for what would become a console war. And the key to their early strategy was a sequel to one of their most ambitious and original titles to date, a role-playing game that leaned into science fiction instead of westernized fantasy. This is the story of Phantasy Star II. Throughout this video, we will cover the changes in the broader video gaming landscape that influenced how and why Phantasy Star II was made, the key players involved and why specific design philosophies were adopted, and what happened in and around the game's launch. But if you're a massive Phantasy Star fan and want an even deeper breakdown, which will go into much more detail about the game's legacy, be sure to check out our Patreon for the extended Director's Cut edition of this video. Plus, you'll also get early access to our episode on Ys 3, which is live right now, and exclusive bonus episodes on lesser-known games like Hydralide and Destiny of an Emperor. But without further ado, this is the story of Phantasy Star II. Sega released Phantasy Star on their Mark III system in December of 1987, and it was a huge hit with the audience they'd built up in the preceding years. But there was little time for its creators to celebrate and reflect on the incredible product they delivered. Due to the nature of how Sega operated, many members of the development team were quickly shuffled to work on other projects, particularly artist Reiko Kodama and programmer Yuji Naka. Phantasy Star had proved their expertise and reliability, and with Sega's next major hardware innovation just around the corner, that expertise was needed to help them create compelling launch titles. This was because almost as soon as Sega had begun selling the Mark III in 1985, they were already thinking about what was next. The Mark III itself was their third revision on their 8-bit platform in as many years, beginning with the Mark I in 1983, which was followed up by the SG-1000 in 1984. But with the Mark III, Sega finally felt they had a system which stood a chance of going toe-to-toe with Nintendo's Famicom. Unfortunately, the lead was too great by this point, so even though the Mark III carved out a decent niche for itself in the Japanese market, it was still only nipping at Nintendo's heels. Because of this, they felt getting a head start on engineering their next console was the most prudent move, as they could try and close the gap by building on their momentum. Their next console, which had the codename Mark V, was designed to be the world's first truly 16-bit console. 16-bit CPUs had already been well established in the arcade market since Namco began using them in 1982, and Sega's own System 16 board had been the key to some of their biggest arcade hits like Alien Syndrome and Fantasy Zone. With twice the processing power of 8-bit systems, 16-bit systems were capable of producing more stunning visuals, with more complex logic fueling the challenge. And this led many consumers to lament that games on home consoles weren't as fast and flashy as those they could play in arcades. Thus, Sega's engineers decided to use the System 16 board as a base for the Mark V system, leveraging their proven technology in the hopes that they could bring their games for home consoles up to the level of their arcade counterparts, and that they could beat Nintendo to the punch. However, with improved technology came increased production costs. The 16-bit CPUs were naturally more expensive than 8-bit CPUs, and Sega was hesitant to make their next system too expensive for fear of hurting profitability or scaring off consumers. Luckily, the success of the Mark III earned them some clout with chip manufacturers. Sega were therefore able to negotiate a deal with Motorola to secure their MC68000 CPU for their new console, offering to buy 300,000 chips up front, but only if Motorola sold them for a tenth of the original price. If the console performed well, Sega believed they could sell as many as 1 million units, something that tantalized Motorola around future income, so they took the deal. Sega also sourced a secondary CPU for the console, the Zlog Z80, an older 8-bit chip previously used in the Mark III, but this time they made it a dedicated processor for audio, therefore reducing the amount of stress on the main processor and preventing gameplay interference from creating sound issues. The resulting console, called the Sega Mega Drive, was named for the fact that megabit cartridges were now a technical standard, although due to regional copyright issues, North American gamers came to know it as the Sega Genesis instead. The Mega Drive was released in Japan in October of 1988 at a retail price of 21,000 yen, which at the time was around $130. And alongside the console, there were two available launch titles, Space Harrier 2 and Super Thunderblade, the latter of which was overseen by Yuji Naka, who served as executive producer. Out of the gate, the Mega Drive's increased graphical capabilities set it apart, and the initial shipment of 50,000 units was sold out within just 2 days. This meant Sega held their own in the market, even as Nintendo released their long-awaited Super Mario Bros. 3 on the Famicom 2 weeks later. A few months after launch, Sega then released a Master System converter to make the Mega Drive backwards compatible with the previous generation's games, thus quickly bolstering the library of titles available for the new system and enticing more customers to buy in. However, there was already another competitor on the market using 16-bit technology to try and fight off Nintendo, the NEC PC Engine. Despite having dominance over the PC market thanks to the PC-88, NEC didn't want to miss out on the emerging console scene. So, in response to the boom of game consoles, NEC had worked with Hudson Soft to create their own console. Unlike the Mega Drive, the PC Engine used an 8-bit processor, but it had dual 16-bit GPUs and posed a potent technical challenge to Sega's fledgling new console. Their offering had also been on sale for a full year before the Mega Drive, having launched in October of 1987. It meant that, while the Mega Drive was backwards compatible, they'd also shot themselves in the foot by porting some of their games, like Phantasy Zone, to the PC Engine. And NEC had also secured the first console port of R-Type, a side-scrolling shooter that had become a massive hit in the arcades. Sega therefore knew it wasn't enough to simply produce hardware with strong technical specs. They needed to offer a compelling software library too. If they wanted to get a head start on the dawning 16-bit era before Nintendo, and hold back NEC in the process, good games were key. And these games couldn't just be more arcade ports and sports sims. Fortunately, Sega had a game for the Master System they could capitalize on. Phantasy Star had been a considerable hit for the company, selling over 200,000 copies against stiff competition from Dragon Quest III and Final Fantasy. It set itself apart with a unique visual approach, blending science fiction and fantasy, and everyone involved, players, developers and Sega itself, was eager to do more with it. Even as some team members split off to develop other projects like Super Thunderblade, discussion of a sequel was already beginning to simmer. Sega even held a contest in Beat magazine where readers could send their ideas in for a hypothetical sequel, which planted the seeds of anticipation in gamers' minds across the country, well before the game even existed. 29 winners were chosen for their scenarios, illustration and game mechanic ideas, and they were invited to a planning meeting at Sega's headquarters in March of 1988, where they spoke to developers like Naka and Kodama. One such winner was 17-year-old Masahiro Sakurai, who was chosen for a game system idea. When speaking to developers at the reception, he expressed that too many games had become to feel unoriginal to him, citing specifically that since Ys had come out, too many games were trying to copy what made that game fun instead of trying to innovate themselves. Young Sakurai called on the developers at Sega to play more boring games and look at what truly makes games interesting instead of constantly trying to imitate the games that were most successful. The experience gave Naka, Kodama, and other developers plenty to mull on as they individually worked on a slew of different projects. Kodama in particular was in high demand, and Miki Morioto, an assistant coordinator on Phantasy Star, was even assigned to plan a spin-off of sorts called Hoshi or Sagashite, or Searching the Stars. Set in the same solar system as Phantasy Star, the game was a classic text adventure where the player was a spacefaring pilot who brings home a gift for his girlfriend, an egg which hatches into a mysterious yet adorable creature called a Mio. Though it would prove to be somewhat apocryphal of the rest of the series, Kodama worked on Searching the Stars as an artist, and it was one of the 4 games she contributed to after the release of Phantasy Star, including a sequel to Alex Kidd and a Mega Drive port of Altered Beast. As schedules began to clear though, and a team coalesced to work on a true Phantasy Star sequel, a big question emerged. what system should they develop it for? Originally, it was assumed that Phantasy Star II was going to be developed for the Mark III so it could build directly off the first game's proven core. The situation gradually changed over the course of 1988, however, with the original team divided to work on a handful of different projects, and the Mega Drive's launch demanding more resources. By the time development was set to begin in earnest, the pressure was on to produce games for the Mega Drive instead. Sega saw that a competition for the new age of video gaming hardware was taking shape, and they were eager to hold back both the PC engine and get a well-established lead before Nintendo could counter with their own console. The 16-bit era was going to be a battleground, and Sega knew arcade ports and new processors weren't enough. They needed to leverage all the advantages they had, and this meant producing their best possible software lineup for their new system, so as to attract every possible type of fan. And thus, Sega greenlit Phantasy Star II for the Mega Drive in the hopes of producing an early cornerstone title for their new 16-bit platform. Now, if you're enjoying the video so far, then might we suggest checking out our Patreon. You can find a longer, deeper extended edition of this video, while also getting ad-free early access to our upcoming video on Ys 3, and exclusive access to videos on Heidelide and Destiny of an Emperor that are not planned to be published on YouTube. By becoming a patron, you'll also get early access to all of our future episodes, as well as podcasts and Discord access, and you can vote on what we cover as our out-of-sequence episode every season. But whether you join us on Patreon or continue to watch us here on YouTube, we just want to say a big thank you for your support. For now though, let's get right into the development of Phantasy Star II. By the time the decision to make a sequel to Phantasy Star was finalised, a number of interesting factors were at play. Most of the core individuals were able to return from the previous game, with Ryuhei Kodama on design and Tokuhiko Iwabo composing. Chieko Aoki, who had created the setting for the original Phantasy Star, also returned as writer, but was now promoted to the role of director, while Yuji Naka was promoted to producer, in addition to his programming. Kotaro Hayashida also returned, contributing to the game's planning. But the original team was bolstered by new talents as well, and it meant there was a nice 1-to-1 ratio between veterans and newcomers. The veterans were no stranger to having plenty of fresh eyes on their projects, given the strong mentoring culture of the company. The bigger challenge, though, was reconciling the established Phantasy Star formula with new hardware, in what was planned to be a relatively short period. By the time the move to the Mega Drive was confirmed and development began in earnest, the team was only given about 6 months to complete the game, and they soon discovered that any initial thoughts they had needed to be reconfigured and rescoped due to how the Mega Drive functioned in comparison to the Mark III. Following the success of the original game, Aoki had assumed a sequel would be possible. She therefore jumped straight into creating a new scenario well before development on Phantasy Star II was even given the green light. Once it became clear that the broader plans were aligned with her assumptions, Aoki then served as a pseudo-cheerleader, even urging Naka to finish Super Thunderblade faster so they could get to work on Phantasy Star II instead. Her vision was for the sequel to be set 1,000 years after the original, but it would still focus upon the same star system and its trio of planets. Originally, a familiar face was planned to be the protagonist, Lutz, the wizard party member from the first game, or Noah as he was known in the English version. This was viable as he had entered a cryogenic sleep after the first game, and they planned to have him awake a millennium later to find the system under the custodianship of the Mother Brain, a powerful artificial intelligence. A complete story draft was completed with Lutz at the helm, and they planned for Phantasy Star II to have a much deeper, more mature narrative path. In that regard, the Mother Brain and the main monstrous entities, called biomonsters, were designed to reflect real-world concerns about technology and humanity's relationship with nature. There was even a planned event that would have seen the native Motabian people blamed for a flood that Lutz's party had actually caused, and this would lead to them being summarily hunted down by Mother Brain's robots. However, Naka suggested that Lutz was too weak a character to be promoted to main protagonist, and his assertions related to both his narrative importance, due to his personality being undefined in the first game, but also potential gameplay options. Ultimately, this led to the plot being reworked to focus on a new protagonist named Eustace, or Rolf in the English version, who was made a descendant of Alice, the previous game's heroine. Lutz returned as a vital NPC instead, while descendants of the remaining party members, Odin and Meow, could also be encountered. Several events from the previous draft were scaled back or cut, and other events, such as the aforementioned flood of Motab, were changed so that the party prevented the flood instead of causing it. Aoki also had a change of heart about a scene which meant Lutz could have gone back in time to help Alice, the game's original heroine. Upon reflection, she feared that potentially erasing past events could undermine the previous game's story. Regardless, through the change from the Mark III to Mega Drive, Aoki was able to push for Phantasy Star II to feature a more complex narrative. This meant everything was bigger and better, and they were able to bring ambitious narrative set pieces to life and make the game feel more advanced. And among the new story beats added was the dramatic and permanent loss of a character. This impacted not only the story, but the nature of gameplay, as the character's inclusion in the party was mandatory up until that point. Returning players were also in for another shock through the game's setting. Near the story's third act, after a sequence in the series' first one-time visit dungeon, a key location from the first game was destroyed. Thus, Phantasy Star II scenario was able to present something familiar for returning fans, while taking the original's blend of science fiction and fantasy to new heights, and they just had fun with it. With such advanced technology, restoring fallen party members, for example, was achieved through cloning them instead of reviving them through spiritual magic, as in most other role-playing games. And characters' equipment leaned a little more into science fiction, with some characters using guns, shotguns, and gasoline guns. The team even considered adding another feline party member in the spirit of Meow from the original game, but they ultimately couldn't find a way to make it look right. While the Mega Drive allowed Aoki to take the story further, the teams behind the game's graphics and programming found unexpected struggles. To try and make things easier, they opted to use some of the ideas provided by the Beat Magazine contest winners to form a base. And from this, Naka originally had sought to recreate the 3D first-person dungeons that made Phantasy Star stand out so well, as in theory, with a transition to a 16-bit console, it should have been possible to present an even more impressive version of the scrolling effect. But Naka hit a wall. Despite the enhanced capabilities of the Mega Drive's processor, storage and time proved to be the bigger obstacles. For the original game, he had been able to extensively condense the files needed to animate the dungeon's scrolling effect, but he could not recreate this for the Mega Drive, at least within the time frame given. Ultimately, due to how much planning time there was up front, when the programmers could actually begin their work, there was only a little more than 3 months left before the deadline, and Naka realised that even with spacious cartridges, there simply would not be room for all the monster and dungeon data on top of supporting the previous game's first-person perspective. Due to how passionate he was about this, even though using a larger cartridge risked driving up the retail price considerably, Naka personally went to an executive meeting to beg for an upgrade. As a compromise, Naka promised that he would make the game's deadline no matter what, so Sega's higher-ups agreed, as in the early days of the console, they needed every win they could get. The only way to meet this promise, though, was to simply give up on the original approach and shift to a top-down perspective like the game's overworld. It was a safe play, but it avoided a costly period of trial and error to see if the visual style could even be attained. Hayashida, for one, was not upset by the change. While the 3D dungeons had helped Phantasy Star stand out from the competition, he didn't believe they defined the game, and in some cases, they'd even hindered it, as the ability to save mid-dungeon had led some people to essentially trap themselves in a weakened state. So they decided to focus on other areas which made the first game a success, like the science fiction fantasy setting and the battle animations. Like most studios, the graphics were divided, with Kodama leading character designs, Toru Ishida leading monster designs, and Yasushi Yamaguchi leading mechanical designs. But Sega had a unique advantage, in that most members of the team also had enough experience to work on graphics. As such, people weren't limited to only doing characters or backgrounds, as they could contribute to other areas, or at least offer insightful advice outside of their own assignments, effectively making main graphics and sub-graphics roles. It also allowed for better harmony with designs, as monsters that were designed by one person were not jarringly different from those made by someone else. The assets themselves were also improved. Briefly animating each monster during attacks had been a hallmark of Phantasy Star. In the sequel, those animations were made longer, more distinct, and they weren't restricted to attacks, making monsters seem more real and compensating for the loss of immersion that came from them abandoning the first-person perspective. Instead of occurring in the backdrop of dungeons, battles were also changed to occurring on a generic 3D wireframe plane regardless of the current location. And to further mitigate the changing presentation style, Phantasy Star II's battles were shifted to showing the playable party from behind, and it showed them actually performing their attacks. This set it apart from most other role-playing games, which still showed attacks or slashes or bursts of magic with no connection to the actual characters. Outside of the battle scene though, Phantasy Star II looked much like its predecessor, adopting the familiar Dragon Quest style top-down perspective. But they utilised taller, more realistic proportioned sprites than those used in Dragon Quest, Final Fantasy and most other role-playing games. They were also more advanced and detailed, and townspeople could move around the map instead of standing still. However, the large-scale portraits which had been shown when speaking to characters in the original game were removed for the sequel, replaced with smaller profile shots and important story moments. Thus, while the story had become more complex, the on-screen exposition was somewhat scaled back, limited to text boxes most of the time. As the top-down perspective for the overworld was now employed in dungeons as well, to help distinguish dungeons from towns, Phantasy Star II employed parallax scrolling effects, a benefit of the jump to 16-bit, which allowed two different layers of graphics to scroll simultaneously. The developers used the effect to make a foreground layer pass faster than the background layer, thus simulating that the party was inside a building or structure, and that the player was effectively looking at them through the ceiling. Most of the dungeons were designed by a newer member of the team who was eager to make them complicated, but due to his rookie enthusiasm, he overcompensated. The more senior developers recognised that his designs were overly dense, and they considered redoing them, but Aoki didn't want to discourage a newcomer and simply waste all of their effort, especially given the tight schedule. Ultimately, the dungeon designs were incorporated into the game with minor changes and much trepidation. There was concern that these key areas could become monotonous, but there was also hope that one of Naka's innovations could counterbalance it. He devised a macro battle system which he hoped would make grinding less tedious. By choosing the fight command, Phantasy Star II's battles would carry out semi-automatically until the enemies were defeated or until the player interrupted. But by using the strategy command, players could choose specific attacks for the heroes to use, while also being able to change equipment or even flee if things were going badly. Thus, players didn't need to stress over every single battle, especially as dungeons ground on or as the characters became stronger. While the graphics team experimented with Phantasy Star II's visual presentation, Tokuhiko Owabo explored the Mega Drive's potential for sound. In addition to the dedicated audio processor, the Mega Drive also had a more advanced synthesizer chip in Yamaha's YM2612, and thus Owabo was able to expand the sequel's soundtrack considerably. Both planets received distinct town and overworld themes to help distinguish them. And by the same token, Owabo composed several different pieces to use in dungeons, offering a break from the standard dungeon theme. His compositions leaned into the Mega Drive's richer instrumentation to make the worlds and emotions of Phantasy Star II more vibrant. Meanwhile, two new staff members were assigned to support him, specifically there to create sound effects. The robust soundscape of crisp music and a plethora of sci-fi beeps and boops rounded out the advanced, yet radically divergent presentation of the Mega Drive's first role-playing game. In the remarkably short period of time spent on development, the team at Sega's R&D2 division concocted a sequel that both honoured its predecessor while breaking from its formula in many regards, thanks to either the time constraints imposed or the steep learning curve of developing for the new Mega Drive. The last step of the rapid-fire development was the debugging process, which was only given a couple of weeks, but the bigger problem was once again capacity issues. Even with the additional space Naka had negotiated for, it seemed the same old problem had reared its ugly head. A handful of finished monster designs by Yoshida were cut, while others were left dummied and unused on the cartridge. A few items were also trimmed, namely 2 optional items that reference characters from the first game, and another called the Master System, as a tongue-in-cheek reference to the older console. With 119 different enemies, each with their own animations, 8 playable characters and over a dozen dungeon areas, Phantasy Star II had hit the boundaries of the cartridge, and there was no time for Naka to attempt the same compression magic he'd used for the Master System original. Limitations aside, the whirlwind development of Phantasy Star II was a tremendous achievement in itself, one which Yashida believed would have been impossible without Naka. In under 6 months, the team had battled the double threat of dealing with a tight schedule and learning new hardware to produce an even bigger game than their previous creation. All that remained was to begin production and see how the public received the fruits of their labour. With the contest in Beat magazine appearing shortly after the original game's release, the idea of Phantasy Star II had been planted in consumers' minds early on, and as the sequel's release appeared on the horizon, Sega began to leverage that anticipation with a substantial ad campaign. While appealing to readers of magazines like Beep and Famitsu, and capitalising on the series' name, Sega decided to cast a wider net and even advertised Phantasy Star II in more general publications. They also courted wholesale merchants with demo units and large promo materials to use in stores, hoping to reach consumers who wouldn't normally consider themselves gamers. And this notion was buoyed by Sega being hopeful that Phantasy Star II could prove the sort of flagship experience that could entice proven gamers and total newcomers alike to buy into the Mega Drive. They also put extra emphasis on the size of the cartridge and its prestige as the first 16-bit RPG, hoping to get a leg up on Dragon Quest III's lingering influence with the power of more realistic graphics. To avoid stepping on their own toes in this regard, the company fought hard to keep the game's price down as much as possible and finally settled on a retail price of 8,800 yen, or around $55 at the time. This was a moderate increase on other Mega Drive games such as Super Thunder Blade or Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle, which sold for around 5,500 yen. But it was just on the cusp of what they could afford, and it meant Sega risked making no profits on any sales. 15 months after the release of the original game, Phantasy Star II went on sale on the 21st of March 1989, and it made a decent impression right away. In its first week on sale, it sold 35,000 copies and debuted at number 3 in the charts, trailing behind only Super Mario Bros. 3 and a Shonen Jump crossover, Famicom Jump Hero Retsuden. However, the residual sales weren't that strong, and Phantasy Star II fell off the top charts by May. By the end of the year, it had only sold 40,561 copies, ranking as the 69th best-selling game released in 1989. And falling well behind even Dragon Quest III, which had sold 55,000 copies in its second year on sale. This could have reflected poorly on Phantasy Star II itself, but it was more of a failure on the Mega Drive's part to penetrate the market early on. Nintendo was an absolute sales juggernaut, owing to the combined efficiency of the deeply entrenched Famicom and the incredible launch of the Game Boy in April of that year. It meant that despite being a strong console, the Mega Drive only carved out about 3.6% of total software sales in Japan for that year, which was achieved with them only releasing 15 titles. The Famicom, though, comprised 72% of software sales spread across 113 titles. Worse for Sega was that they had been outperformed by the PC Engine. Twice as many games were released on that system, allowing them to secure 4.7% of total software sales. Nonetheless, Phantasy Star II was at least considered a success internally at Sega. The developers were pleased with their work, having implemented so many new things, and given everything that had happened behind the scenes, they felt that Phantasy Star II was a sequel that they should be proud of. The sentiment was not shared by Famitsu's reviewers though, as Phantasy Star II was only awarded a 28 out of 40. The editors praised its parallax scrolling and graphics, compelling enemies, and its engaging plot, but they lamented the difficulty of the dungeon segments. Indeed, Sega's player hotline was flooded with calls immediately after launch, with players seeking advice on how to proceed past certain challenges. Luckily, in anticipation of the game's challenge, Sega had prepared an official Phantasy Star II guidebook packed with strategies and maps, which proved particularly helpful when the parallax scrolling effects made dungeons disorientating. To the staff's amazement, some players who had been desperately calling the helplines for assistance soon even began calling back to say that they had succeeded in their quests. It meant that, even though Phantasy Star II hadn't reached the same sales records as its competition, or even its predecessor, the creators knew they'd established a community. And given this was a relatively new IP, that in itself was a victory. As with the first game, Sega struck while the iron was hot and proceeded with overseas localizations promptly, and their intentions were soon visible. In January of 1990, Sega America were at the Winter Consumer Electronics Show as a major publisher, showing off their products alongside the likes of Nintendo and Square, who were promoting Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Both games made a strong impression on attendees, but Sega benefited from the existing brand recognition of Phantasy Star's name with English gamers, as well as the impact of having new 16-bit graphics compared to Square's 8-bit graphics. In preparation for the game's English release, the party members' names were tweaked subtly, some to fit within 4 characters like Rudolph becoming Rudo, while the protagonist, Eustace, was drastically changed to Rolf, quite removed from the original game or any resemblance of the original protagonist, Alice. Meanwhile, Sega mixed up the continuity in regards to Lutz. Having changed his name to Noah in Phantasy Star, they kept his name unchanged in the sequel, thus giving no indication to returning players that Lutz in Phantasy Star II was the same person as Noah from Phantasy Star, which obscured a considerable connection and caused potential confusion. as the final dungeon was a satellite also named Noah in reference to the biblical ark. Due to regional differences between sound drivers, the overseas editions also featured slightly rebalanced audio, particularly in the snare drums used in commonly recurring tracks. Phantasy Star II required little other regional changes though, as Sega did not have the same policies regarding real-world religious iconography or content that Nintendo had, and the far future setting rendered most symbols effectively irrelevant to begin with. The physical packaging replaced the original watercolor cover, painted by prolific illustrator Hitoshi Yoneda, with a more westernized rendition of Rolf and Ney. The new art portrayed both characters as slightly older and leaned into the alien elements of the story, making Ney look more like an alien than an elf, while portraying the mother brain as a literal brain monster instead of a computer system in a humanoid frame. However, overseas copies of Phantasy Star II had extra value, which came in the form of the same strategy guide that Nintendo had sold separately in Japan. The Japanese office made their guide available to Sega of America for the localization, and marketing head Al Nilsson saw a unique opportunity. Bundling the helpful booklet with the game would add extra value to the biggest, most expensive game they'd made to date, while offering a helping hand to any customers who were wary about getting into role-playing games. This helped close the gap with its upstart competitor in North America, Dragon Warrior, which had famously been given away by Nintendo Power magazine alongside a strategy guide. The English ad campaign leaned into the record-breaking size of the game, boldly declaring, until now, you needed a computer to play an adventure game as advanced as Phantasy Star II. Now you don't. The size, scale and difficulty were also hyped up, hinting at hundreds of hours of playtime. A year after its initial release in Japan, Phantasy Star II went on sale in North America in March of 1990, and in Europe later the same year. In America, the high-capacity cartridge drove its price to $70, much more than the regular games that were in the $40 to $60 range, something that further justified Nilsson's decision to include the strategy guide. Fortunately for Sega, Western critics were very enthused about the massive RPG. Electronic Gaming Monthly scored it as a 32 out of 40, singing its praises. And to make things even better, two of their editors admitted they enjoyed the experience despite liking neither the original nor role-playing games in general. They felt the size of the quest helped justify the considerable price tag, especially with such stimulating visuals. European critics agreed, as Video Games and Computer Entertainment magazine scored Phantasy Star as a 9 out of 10, calling it a little less cute and significantly more dramatic, and even praising the transition to a top-down dungeon perspective which they felt made mapping progress easier. In a poetic full-circle moment, Wizardry designer Ro Adams wrote a glowing review in Computer Gaming World, complimenting the game design and the full range of animations in battle, though he took the inclusion of so much spoiler-rich supplemental material as a sign that Sega of America had a rather low opinion of the game-playing ability of the average Genesis owner. While sales of Phantasy Star II were never officially reported, the competition for role-playing games was much thinner in English markets at the time, especially as it arrived between Dragon Warrior and Final Fantasy. To its advantage, Sega had been more successful selling Genesis consoles in North America, and by the end of 1990 had sold a combined 1.5 million consoles. So Phantasy Star II was a big fish in a rapidly growing pond, packing considerably more advanced graphics than either of its major competitors. Meanwhile in Europe, it remained one of the only role-playing games in town, even if it was somewhat hamstrung by only including an English translation. Even though it's unknown how Phantasy Star II performed commercially on a global scale, despite not drawing massive lines like Dragon Quest was in Japan, it was still resonating with gamers, and it heralded a promising start for Sega's 16-bit era. The assigned team had been given a seemingly impossible task, but through sheer grit, determination and resilience, and a high degree of innovation, they were able to create an enduring game that helped continue the good Phantasy Star name and continue to build solid foundations for the next generation of the franchise. But with that, thank you so much for watching everyone. My name is Darryl, and together with Chris and Colin, we hope you've enjoyed listening to the incredible development history of Phantasy Star II. Hopefully, as you watched through the video, you found some interesting nuggets of information that perhaps you didn't know before. If you did, then please consider showing us how much you appreciate the effort that's put into researching, writing and editing a video like this by giving it a like. We also want to give a massive thanks to all of our Patreon supporters as they allow us to create extensive videos like this one. Alright everyone, with that, this is Darryl signing out. I'll see you all again soon for more RPG goodness.